Hello, this is part 2 of anti-infective drugs. So we were just discussing microorganisms and bacteria in particular, and how we identify different types of bacteria and how a physician will determine which type of drug will work best against a particular species of bacteria. In this section, we're going to look at antibiotic drugs, and antibiotic drugs are drugs that are used to treat bacterial infections, and only bacterial infections. So they are not effective against other types of microorganisms like viruses or fungus or protozoa in general. We'll talk about a couple exceptions. So antibiotic drugs are by definition developed from living organisms. In most cases, it's usually species of fungus. If that particular antibiotic drug kills bacteria, we say it is bactericidal, and usually it works by destroying the cell wall, or it can interfere with the bacteria's DNA, and that kills the organism. If the antibiotic drug works by not killing the bacteria but inhibiting the growth of the bacteria, we say that it is bacteriostatic. And it usually does this by interfering with the ability of that bacteria to make proteins. And so it can't grow, it can't reproduce, and usually that buys enough time for our immune system to kill the bacteria on its own. Antibiotic drugs can come in many forms and can be delivered by many routes. So we find antibiotic drugs in topical format, so in creams that we can rub on local infections. Often they're given orally, so they have a systemic response, or they can be given intravenously as well. This is a very cool scanning electron micrograph picture of the cellular effects of treatment of, in this case, E. coli bacteria with amoxicillin. So you can see how it's destroying the cell wall of this particular bacteria. We can divide antibiotic drugs into two main categories. Broad-spectrum antibiotic drugs are ones that are effective against many types of bacteria, so both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. And of course, the advantage of having a broad-spectrum antibiotic is that it will treat many different types of bacterial infections. The disadvantage is that if we use that antibiotic drug to treat many different types of infections, then we can end up creating species of bacteria that are resistant to that antibiotic drug just because it's used so often. A narrow-spectrum antibiotic drug is an antibiotic that is effective against only very specific strains of bacteria. And again, the disadvantage is that we have to be able to identify that strain specifically so that we get a drug that treats it. But the advantage is that then we are only using that particular drug when we have that particular type of infection. And so bacteria aren't exposed to that particular drug, a narrow-spectrum antibiotic, often, and so they don't have a chance to develop evolutionarily resistance against that drug. Most of our new antibiotics are bacteria-specific, narrow-spectrum, for that particular reason. We'll go through the main categories of antibiotic drugs. I don't expect you to remember specific antibiotic drugs, and I will point out the important points about each family of drug. So one of the most well-known groups or families of antibiotics are the penicillins. And penicillin was the very first antibiotic drug that was discovered. It was discovered actually in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, but was not really manufactured or used in any wide basis until World War II. And he did win a Nobel Prize for this discovery. Penicillin is produced from a species of fungus that we see on the right-hand picture, Penicillium notatum. Most penicillin drugs have the ending cillin, and so anytime you see something like amoxicillin or ampicillin or cloxacillin, penicillin 5, etc., then or penicillin V, then these are all in that particular family. Because penicillin has been around for such a long period of time, there are bacteria that are resistant to penicillin. And these bacteria have evolved to produce an enzyme called penicillinase that breaks down the penicillin drugs, and that's why that penicillin isn't effective against them. One of the other features of this family is that some people have very serious allergies against penicillin drugs, and so as a result you have to be really aware of that particular allergy before you administer a penicillin drug. Penicillin drugs should also be taken on an empty stomach in order for them to be absorbed. Cephalosporins is another group of antibiotic drugs. They are structurally related to the penicillin family, so therefore there's an allergy concern. So if somebody has an allergy to penicillin, then they should not be prescribed a cephalosporin either. They're used if a bacteria is resistant to penicillin, and then that person could be prescribed with a cephalosporin. There are 4 generations of cephalosporins, as they have evolved, they've become more and more effective against gram-positive bacteria and more effective against the bacteria that produce that penicillinase and have become resistant. They are also more expensive in the later generations also. A little dating fun fact is that cephalosporins are derived from a fungus called Cephalosporium, and it was actually discovered in a sewer outlet near Sardinia in 1948. So it must be a very exciting vocation to be a pharmacologist back then, where you are lurking in the sewers discovering new species of fungus to turn into drugs. Another family of antibiotic drugs are the aminoglycosides. They often end in mycin or myosin, so for example streptomycin or gentamicin or neomycin. These drugs have to be given by injection, and they have very serious side effects. They can affect the kidney, causing toxicity in the kidney. They can cause hearing loss, vertigo. They can cause respiratory paralysis. And so as a result, somebody that is taking one of these antibiotics usually has a very severe infection, and they have to be monitored with hearing tests and blood tests. They have to be given by injection because they're very poorly absorbed in the GI tract, and so they're usually given by intramuscular or intravenously, and often a person is admitted into the hospital in order to receive these types of antibiotics. Tetracyclines, this is another family of antibiotic drugs. They have a broader spectrum of activity than other classes of antibiotics, so they're effective against a wide variety of both gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria. So as a result, because they are broad spectrum and they've been around for a while, there's lots of species of bacteria that are resistant against this group of antibiotics. So usually now they're only used when other antibiotics are not working. You have to take tetracyclines on an empty stomach in order for them to be absorbed. They're usually only prescribed to adults because they can cause this discoloration that you see up here in this picture in infants and in children. This is one of those drugs that as it starts to degrade, it produces a toxic substance, and as a result it can be fatal if it's taken after its expiry date because it causes damage to the kidney. Another group of antibiotics are called the macrolides, so things like erythromycin, azithromycin, clarithromycin. These are one of the least toxic antibiotics, and so they have the fewest side effects. They are usually prescribed as an alternative to penicillins or cephalosporins if somebody is allergic to penicillin. Again, it's been around quite a while, and so as a result there are some bacteria that are resistant to this group of antibiotics. The quinolones things like ciprofloxacin, levofloxacin, moxifloxacin, these also can have very serious side effects, especially in kids and in seniors. They shouldn't be taken by people that have recurring seizures, and again, there are a number of bacterial species that are resistant to this group of antibiotics. The last group of antibiotics that we'll discuss are the Lincosamides, so for example, clindamycin. These ones can get rid of a lot of our helpful, healthy bacteria in our bowel, and as a result, then other types of more harmful bacteria can move in. So one of the side effects of taking clindamycin is that a person may end up with explosive diarrhea. They may end up with this opportunistic infection. It's used to treat infections that don't respond to other types of antibiotics. They can also be used to treat bacterial acne or for dental infections. A group of drugs that are not antibiotic drugs, because they are, by definition, they are not made from living organisms, but they do have an effect against bacteria, and these are the sulfa drugs, the sulfonamides. These were drugs that were used widely in World War II, so that what you see in the bottom is a little kit for wound dressing that would have been carried by a medic in World War II. So here's the field dressing, and this is the powdered sulfa drug that they would rip open and sprinkle on top of that wound to try to prevent infection. The sulfa drugs were discovered in 1934. There was a German researcher who was screening chemicals to see if they had any medicinal uses, and tested a particular red dye, and it cured a streptococcal infection in mice. The first time he tried it on a human, it was his daughter. So his daughter was dying of a strep infection because she had pricked her finger. He injected her with the dye, and it saved her life. And the dye, it turns out, was converted in the body into a sulfa drug. So these sulfa drugs were the only anti-infective drugs that were used to treat bacterial infections available until penicillin. And so really up until World War II, and really all the way through World War II, it was the main drug that was used to treat bacterial infections. Allergies to sulfa drugs are very common. What you see in the right-hand side are hives as the result of an allergic reaction to a sulfa drug, and you need to take fluids. They still prescribe combinations of sulfa drugs for things like urinary tract infections. So Septra is a very common drug that is prescribed for a UTI. Star, 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 star. There are a number of adverse effects to taking antibiotics, but there are some potential real adverse reactions that if you are giving or administering an antibiotic drug to somebody that you really need to watch out for. And the first one is an allergic reaction. Often a person will start with having hives, but they can have an anaphylactic reaction to antibiotics. So you really need to know about their allergies to drugs. There can also be direct toxicity. As we discussed, some particular groups of antibiotics can have toxic effects on certain tissues. In particular, toxicity to the ear, to the kidney, to the liver, and some of these toxic effects may be permanent. Some of them may be reversible if they stop taking the drug, but often we can cause permanent damage. So you have to watch for that, especially if that's one of those special precautions. A third one are what's called superinfections, or indirect toxicity. And a superinfection is a new infection with different resistant bacteria or fungi as the result of killing off the normal flora in the intestines or in mucous membranes. So, for example, especially if a person takes a broad-spectrum antibiotic, they may get rid of our natural bacteria in the intestine, and then more drug-resistant bacteria or fungus moves in, and so we call a fungus a yeast infection. And the last one, just by the way, those superinfections occur especially when antibiotics are used for a long time or if they're repeated. again and again and again. So the reason we call it a superinfection is because the new infection is superimposed on the original infection, and it can be life-threatening. The last one is resistance, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about antibiotic resistance because this is one of the biggest challenges I think that society has right now. We don't remember what it's like to live in a world without antibiotic drugs, so that when we get a cut on our finger, we're not worried that that's going to be life-threatening. But there was a time before we had antibiotics that bacteria could invade a cut in the finger, could enter the bloodstream, and ultimately cause death. Where we're at right now is we are encountering more and more strains of bacteria that don't respond to the drugs that we have. And this is because bacteria reproduce very quickly, so they mutate very quickly and they evolve to meet the challenges of their existence. And so if we have an antibiotic drug that kills them, that they will evolve to become resistant to that particular drug. So when we talk about antibiotic resistance, we're talking about bacteria that have mutated or evolved so that they are no longer respond to a particular antibiotic drug. So how does this occur? So if you look at this particular diagram, we start off with lots of different types of bacteria. Maybe a couple are more resistant than others to a drug. That person ends up taking an antibiotic. It kills all of the weaker bacteria, the ones that are causing the illness, but they also kill good bacteria that are protecting our body from infection, and they leave the drug-resistant bacteria behind. So the drug-resistant bacteria are now allowed to grow, and they take over. In addition, some bacteria may actually pass on their drug resistance to other bacteria, making different strains now resistant to those particular drugs. This can happen especially if a person stops taking their antibiotics before they complete their full course of antibiotics. So in that particular case, they kill off all the weak bacteria, they stop taking the antibiotics, and any bacteria that were slightly resistant to that drug are allowed to reproduce. And the infection may return, or even if it doesn't return, that those bacteria may live to fight another day and become more and more resistant. So this can happen if the drug is prescribed too frequently. So for example, if physicians are pressured by patients, especially parents, that say, I need an antibiotic. It can also occur if, as I said, if a person takes their antibiotics incorrectly, so that there's ineffective exposure, so the infections aren't treated completely. So if they discontinue before the end of the drug course, or if they don't take it as it's directed. But the other parts that can really contribute to antibiotic resistance are things that aren't related to human illness. So for example, if we put antibacterial substances in hand soaps and cleaning products, we'll expose those bacteria to our antibiotic drugs in very, very weak amounts that aren't really effective, and we don't need to do that. The other part is that if we give antibiotics that are prescribed to animals, then the meat contains traces of antibiotics, and so our bacteria end up being exposed to the antibiotics that were given to those animals. And when we combine that all together, we create a very, very serious situation. So currently we do have lots of different strains of bacteria that are resistant to one or more antibiotic drugs, and we have some strains that are resistant to all but maybe one particular antibiotic, or maybe all known antibiotics. So a couple examples: methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, MRSA, is resistant to almost all known antibiotics except for vancomycin. And just by the way, there are bacteria that are resistant against vancomycin, so one of the concerns is that, again, if those bacteria confer their resistance to MRSA, we will have nothing to treat a MRSA infection. Carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, or CRE, this bacteria has become resistant to all or nearly all the antibiotics that we have today. And about 50% of people who become infected with CRE will die because we can't treat their infection. So drug companies right now are racing to try to create new antibiotic drugs. Part of it is that antibiotic drugs may not be as profitable as other types of drugs, and so it doesn't seem from a business perspective good to put in money into developing new antibiotics. So there needs to be some government support, I think, for looking at new antibiotic strains, but mostly we can't keep up with how fast the bacteria are reproducing and mutating and evolving. And I think that we need to look at our use of antibiotics really seriously in order to try to prevent us entering an era, which could happen very, very soon, where we don't have antibiotics to treat bacterial infections. This, by the way, has been designated as an international crisis by the World Health Organization. Okay, I'm going to stop here and we'll resume in part 3.